Hello, everybody. I'm here today to talk about a 1976 compilation album on Capitol called The Best of George Harrison. Now, prior to this, John Lennon already had his own compilation album out called Shaved Fish, and Ringo Starr had a compilation out called Blast from Your Past. Both of these were better received than George's album, and there's a lot of disappointment and disapproval in the history of this album. I'm going to talk about The Best of George Harrison. And while I can understand it from a point of semantics, I'm going to say how I kind of think this is still a good package anyway. I'm going to kind of defend it here while acknowledging some of the flaws. Okay? Now, George Harrison had an album in 1976, November, and that album was called 33 and a Third, which I think, and I think a lot of Harrison fans would concur, is one of his better releases, one of his better albums. However, that really came out just after this album I'm going to talk about, this compilation. So while we have some hit songs, really noteworthy tracks on that album, 33 and a Third, that could have been included here, this thing came out too early. So they don't really become contenders. Talking about like Crackerbox Palace or this song, those two songs had this album, Best of George Harrison, come out, say, a year later, 1977, those two songs could have been on here. But we have to take 33 and a Third out of the equation because it wasn't released yet. So what we have here are George's solo albums from 1970 through 1975. All Things Must Pass, through Extra Texture. And now here's what I'm going to say. When you really take into consideration, if we're talking hits, George didn't really have enough big hits to be on the album. Although, granted, if you were to take some album tracks, he certainly had a lot of very good album tracks that could have been used here on The Best of George Harrison. That's for sure. They did that with Ringo's album and also John's album. I mean, you got album tracks that weren't big hits or anything off Lennon and Starr's albums, so you might say, well, why couldn't it be done for George? Well, with Capitol, there was some kind of animosity going on here. I think it was a kind of like no love lost between George and the Capitol Company. So that has something to do with it. I'm going to first show you, before we get really talking about this, the covers. In the UK, this was the cover that was used. And most fans, I believe, prefer this cover. That's the back of it with the track listings. Inside we have inner sleeve looking like this. It's a nice shot of George. And let's see, the album itself is on the Parlophone label. At least this copy that I have, EMI Parlophone. Now, the American album, the US, is what gets a lot of flack. And I'm going to defend this cover because I like it better than the one with just propping George up against a car, using a picture like that. I like this. I think it's more creative. Now, let's go into some details here. This is the Best of George Harrison US. Now, what I like about this cover is George was always very mystical, right? He was always into Indian music and meditation, things like that. So I like George's face in the cosmos, so to speak. He's out there up in the stars, the deep thinker, the mystical one. Okay? Some people have pointed out, and I never thought about it when I was a kid, but the outline here, take a look at it. Some people suggest it's a middle finger. It's like giving you the middle finger to George. Some people suggest it's the male anatomy, private part. You know what I mean, okay? But other than that, I think this cover would have looked even better had they gotten rid of the white outline, the white lines around here, and just went for all out George in the heavens. I really like it. And here too, in the back there. I really like this design. All right, inside, now I don't think anybody can really quarrel with this. I think this is really nice. This might even have been good as the front cover. The back one is a picture of George as a boy in there. I like it. I also much prefer this Capitol label by far to the bland black Parlophone one. Got the same images in it. But where the controversy comes and where the disapproval comes is in the choice of songs for this particular release, okay? The problem is that side one consisted of just George Harrison Beatle tracks that he recorded with the Beatles, whereas side two were songs from his solo career. We've got 7 Beatle tracks on side one, and we have only 6 solo tracks on side two. So only 6 out of 13 songs are George solo songs, and that pissed George off. I could understand why. And his family, and also a lot of fans. Nobody gives this any love, this compilation, but I'm going to do that here. I'm going to defend it. First of all, okay, I have a nostalgic like for this, because when I was about 16 years old, 15 or 16 years old, forget which exactly, I was vacationing with the family on the Jersey Shore, and they had a boardwalk in the summertime where you would have all kinds of games you could play. You could put your quarter down and do the spinning wheel and all kinds of stuff, little games to play. And the prizes hanging up there would be record albums. I remember some of the albums that I won when I would hit the right number on the spinning wheel or whatnot. Some of the albums were the bootleg Sweet Apple tracks. I actually got my first copy of that. It was hanging up. I also got McCartney's then new album with Wings, London Town. That's how I first got my copy of London Town. It was a new album, and it was up there, and I won that. And this one I chose one time when I won. So this has a special place in my heart because I remember that. Remember that childhood memory. However, I'm not going to base my whole opinion just on warm, fuzzy feelings. This album is called The Best of George Harrison. So the argument that I make is some of the songs that are used by the Beatles here can be considered the best songs of George Harrison. Simple as that. It's semantics. Sure, they're Beatles songs. That's semantics. Hey, look, didn't we always defend George and say, George got a raw deal in the sense that he was kind of like on his own and lost in the Lennon and McCartney mythos. It was kind of like all about John and Paul, and George was kind of lost. And that was never really fair to George, right? Well, that's what we're saying. If we do believe that it was kind of like George Harrison, even within the Beatles, was always kind of his own man and kind of always on his own island over there, why not look at some of these songs in a way as solo George in a way? I know it's stretching it, and where it's like George songs with the Beatles as his backup, so to speak. I'm going to do the track listing here. I'm going to tell you what's on here. It'll be better if we do that. First of all, let's start with the Beatles side. Okay, we start off with Something. Then we go to If I Needed Someone. Then we have Here Comes the Sun. Then Taxman. Think for Yourself. For You, Blue. And finally, closing side one, the great While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Now, I would argue that at least 3 of these tracks are indeed the best songs of George Harrison. Be they recorded with the Beatles or not, they're the best songs of George Harrison. Those are Something, Here Comes the Sun, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. When you think of the best songs George Harrison ever wrote, I mean, could anybody deny that Something, Here Comes the Sun, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps are indeed the best of George? They are. I know it's semantics. This is supposed to be solo George all on this compilation, right? Well, that's the way I look at it. Now, I will concede that songs like If I Needed Someone, which I love, Taxman, which I love, For You, Blue, which I love, and Think for Yourself, which I love, those 4 are more like, album tracks, a little more, great songs, but kind of expendable for the purposes of the best of. Although Taxman, I think out of those 4, Taxman qualifies the most. to be on here. Maybe they could have done something where they put, for side one, if they wanted to put a little more, or cared enough to put a little more solo George on here, maybe they could have had 4 tracks, which I'll get to later, which I think might have been able to be included here out of the 7 for that side. Side 2 is all solo, but only 6 tracks. We start out with My Sweet Lord. The second track is Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth. Third track is the song You from Extra Texture. Then the single of Bangladesh. And then we have Dark Horse, the main title track from the Dark Horse album. And finally, What Is Life. I think ending this album on What Is Life was wonderful. I really like its placement as the last track on the album, What Is Life. Now, like I say, George has a lot of other great album tracks, but not a lot of hit singles that could have been on here. Bangladesh, for the longest time, this was the only place you could really get that if you didn't have the 45. Before we had CDs and we only had vinyl, this was always a go-to album for Bangladesh, that song. So I like that they put that on here. A lot of times you'll see that compilation albums will do that. They will put stray singles or unusual cuts on an album. So I'm fine with that. And I love that about it. That's a pro for this album. Okay? To have that somewhere where you can get a hold of it. But remember, this only goes up to 1975. What other tracks could they really use on here? Well, solo-wise. Of course, a lot of people are going to say there's tons of great songs to choose from on the great album All Things Must Pass, the title track for one. I would also say Isn't It a Pity is a great track, but it is a tad long. It would kind of take up a lot of the track space on a vinyl album. But, okay, the title track, All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity? But do you really want to put half or 3/4 of the album, All Things Must Pass, on here? There is something to be said about leaving an album, a studio album, alone as its own entity. Let All Things Must Pass be its own thing. They've already got My Sweet Lord and What Is Life on here, the 2 bigger single, like the hits, so to speak, on here. They've already got that covered. What else do you want on here? Let's see, I'm looking at my list. Maybe I would go along with this. What if we had side 1 and we left the 3 Beatles songs I mentioned? Something, Here Comes the Sun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, 3 of George's classics, maybe the 3 greatest. Then we go to, how about Ding Dong Ding Dong? That's kind of a, somewhat, notable single from George, from the Dark Horse album. How about This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying, a single that was on Extra Texture? How about Deep Blue? Now there you go. That's the B-side of Bangladesh, the single. Deep Blue is a very good George song, which doesn't get enough attention. They could have stuck that on here as kind of an extra noteworthy track, and maybe close it out with Isn't It a Pity? Now, as I say, that's 7 tracks, and once you get into longer songs like Isn't It a Pity, they may not all fit properly on a vinyl side. But that's a suggestion that I have. There's not really, at this point in George's career, a lot of time in his career, and a lot of songs that could qualify, really. I just don't think. I would say also that you have to keep in mind that this album was more successful, believe it or not, on the charts, at least in the U.S. In the U.S., this went to number 31 and was a gold record. Became a gold record in 1977, and that did better than John's Shaved Fish and Ringo's Blast From Your Past. Even those albums, even though they were more respectable to the artists in the sense that they consisted only of their solo songs and no Beatles, still they didn't do as well as this. This was a successful album in 1976. And in 1976, when George came out with 33 1/3, I think that helped. I think Paul's tour with Wings in 76 helped. And also the success of the Rock and Roll Music compilation, which is another underrated gem, cover and all, which I'll get to in another video sometime. I really think that helped propel this album somewhat. So I get it. I'm going to close by saying I get what people don't like about it, but to me, it's mostly semantics. Like I said, it's mostly about it should be all solo. It's only right. It's not right not to have solo. It should, technically it should be all solo. Look, this is an enjoyable album as it is. This is an enjoyable listen. Even with the Beatles tracks on there. I mean, I made my case for this. I made some acknowledgments what is not so good and could have been improved upon, but I'm a fan of the album. What are your thoughts? I know I'm going to be all alone here. I don't expect anybody in this case to have my back on this one. Cheers.